On the front lines of World War II, there was a ration harder than a brick. It could knock out a group of German soldiers if thrown. Yet the Soviet army treated it as a life-saving food. This was made with rye flour as the outer layer and potato skins, even mixed with sawdust and tree bark powder, an indescribable thing. In the Soviet Union, it saved the lives of 400,000 Soviet soldiers during the Great Patriotic War, and sustained the fighting strength of at least 10 million Soviet troops. During the toughest times of the Leningrad siege, workers and manual laborers were rationed only 250 grams per day of black bread mixed with husks. As for ordinary citizens, children and non-manual laborers could only get 125 grams of such bread. But even this small amount, which needed a saw to cut, this miraculous mixture, still filled the bellies of Soviets in desperate situations, barely keeping their intestines moving, preventing them from starving completely, and thus helping the Soviet Union achieve the feat of pushing back from Moscow to Berlin. Today, let's talk about the food of the Soviet Army in World War II. To be honest, before the German Army launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Army's food supply was quite good. Thanks to the success of 2 5-year plans, the Soviet Army not only had abundant food reserves, but also established large-scale canning factories, processing plants, flour mills, and more, capable of producing canned goods, salted fish, processed flour, and other industrial foods. So during this period, the Soviet Army had a standardized food supply system. Each soldier's standard ration was 700 grams of black bread, 100 grams of raw meat or fish, 150 grams of grains, 300 grams of potatoes and vegetables. The Soviet Army organized by company, prepared hot meals in field kitchens, and distributed them to soldiers. The most common were thick soups or buckwheat porridge cooked in large pots. Overall, the Soviet Army's food wasn't as good as the American Army's, but it had a complete range of main and side dishes, and was nutritious. At least much better than during the Holodomor in Ukraine. However, as the German Army launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Army was pushed back thousands of miles under the Blitzkrieg, losing vast western territories, fertile agricultural areas, and grain-producing regions. Countless logistics, warehouses, and transport convoys were destroyed or captured. The Soviet Army suddenly ran out of food. The greatest crisis occurred in large encirclement battles like the Kiev Pocket. Hundreds of thousands of encircled Soviet soldiers completely lost access to food, relying only on the small amount of dry rations they carried to barely survive until the food ran out. They had to slaughter horses, search for unharvested crops in the fields, or even eat tree bark and grass roots. This led to many soldiers not dying directly in battle, but from starvation. As the Germans completed large encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk, the Soviet supply lines faced increasing pressure. To relieve the pressure, the Soviet Defense Committee was forced to drastically cut standard rations. Even the daily 800 grams of bread could not be supplied. Many units' bread rations dropped to 500 grams per day or even lower. And the bread was mixed with husks, potatoes, or even sawdust to increase weight. As for meat, fats, sugar, tea, and similar supplies, forget about them. You could only dream of them. The only thing still reliably supplied was vodka. In August 1941, the Soviet Defense Committee issued Order No. 562, listing vodka as a strategic material equal to bread and ammunition, designated for frontline combat troops. 100 grams per person per day, 50 grams for other logistics personnel and technical units. Since this order was made of steel, personally issued by Father Stalin, no one dared to cut corners. So, this standard was enforced until the war's victory, later called the People's Commissar 100 grams. But it was these 100 grams of vodka that became the fighting nation's last line of defense for maintaining morale. In the icy snow, a gulp of 40-proof vodka could instantly make soldiers regain feeling in their frozen limbs. For assault teams that needed to clear the Germans with grenades and submachine guns in close combat, soldiers could receive double portions of vodka. Soldiers called it the feast before the charge. Why? It suppressed the most instinctive fear of facing death, turning it into a brief, reckless fury, then charging fearlessly into counterattacks. According to statistics, in 1942 alone, the Soviet logistics system delivered over 220 million liters of vodka to the front lines, turning human courage into something like fuel that could be poured in at any time. In Zhukov's words, issuing vodka to frontline troops was the right decision. We needed to give soldiers the courage to march in harsh weather, survive in swamps, and make deadly attacks for the great victory. After the victory in the Battle of Moscow, the Soviet Army overcame the toughest period of the Great Patriotic War. In March 1942, Stalin appointed Alexei Kosygin to establish the Front Army, a three-tiered subsidy system for armies and divisions, and elevated logistics work to the same strategic importance as combat, ending the chaotic situation of the war's early days. From the second half of 1942, especially after the Persian Corridor and Arctic route opened, American aid food arrived steadily. The Soviet Army finally solved the problem of what to eat. According to Soviet official archives and U.S. records, during World War II, through the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. provided approximately 4.478 million tons of food aid to the Soviet Union, valued at about $1.65 billion at the time, accounting for roughly 25% of total Lend-Lease supplies. The third largest category after machinery at 34% and munitions at 32%. Among them, Spam canned luncheon meat was one of the top 5 items, totaling 250,000 tons. Initially, Soviet soldiers were not used to the taste of this processed meat, nicknaming it Roosevelt's meat or second-class meat. But they were soon proven wrong. This second-class meat not only became their soup, porridge, and stew's most stable meat source, but also completely resolved the Red Army's protein shortage crisis. Besides that, the Soviet Union also received about 672,000 tons of sugar, 512,000 tons of vegetable oil and animal fats, 330,000 tons of flour and wheat, 288,000 tons of milk powder, 132,000 tons of egg powder, and vast amounts of canned vegetables, chocolate, coffee, and processed cheese. By 1943, when the Soviet Army began its major counteroffensive, soldiers no longer had to eat black bread as hard as bricks. Meals included tasty pure grains and Spam luncheon meat. They could even eat in the field, hearty soups and thick porridges with oil and meat. Thanks to American aid, the Soviet Union resolved its logistics supplies with protein and fat supplies. After all, planes, tanks, and artillery, these industrial goods could be produced with overtime. But food and meat don't grow out of thin air. More importantly, these supplies arrived in bulk from 1942 to 1943, when Soviet agriculture hit its lowest point due to occupation and mobilization, during the most difficult period for logistics. Also the most critical period for the Soviet counteroffensive. The massive arrival of Lend-Lease food meant the Soviets didn't need to divert their already strained transport capacity to ship large amounts of food from the Far East and Siberia to transport grain, allowing it to be freed up to prioritize transporting troops, ammunition, and fuel. In contrast, the German army's food supply, with domestic resources depleted, got worse year by year. In 1943, they could still barely maintain stable logistics supplies, but by 1944, it plummeted drastically. The army could only get half the standard rations, or even one-third. A daily meal was just a small piece of bread and a watery stew or potato soup. Soldiers were often in a state of semi-starvation. In the end, the well-fed Soviet army, in both spirit and body, overwhelmed the starving German army and achieved the feat of pushing back from Moscow to Berlin. Looking back at the changes in the Soviet army's food, it clearly spelled out the outcome of the Eastern Front. In Leningrad, that 125 grams of black bread mixed with sawdust wasn't food. But during the 900-day siege, it was the ticket to resistance that Soviets clutched, even if they had to grit their teeth to hold on. In the icy snow, that 100 grams of vodka wasn't just alcohol. It was the strength to press frozen fingers on the trigger and suppress the fear of death with mental ammunition. Of course, courage alone couldn't sustain the 1,000-mile front of the counteroffensive. Without Kosygин's 3-2 subsidy system, the frontline kitchens would never have stayed warm. Without the 250,000 tons of spam delivered via the Persian corridor, soldiers might not have held their guns steady during the counteroffensive. In contrast, the German army, their food supply collapse was never just bad luck, but a strategic overextension at its core. They had to produce wheat in Stalingrad while sending fertilizer and bread to North Africa. Their homeland's canned meat was already mixed with horse meat and even sawdust. Let's just say, if you can't even fill your soldiers' stomachs, how can you talk about victory?